Hi, my name is Yaneli. The topic we are going to talk about is relevant constitutional provisions of free speech and press. What are constitutional provisions? Constitutional provision is a specifically designated law with a country or nation. Examples of constitutional provisions are the 27 amendments and clauses and articles are found in the Constitution. As the time passes, there will be more provisions made to the Constitution if necessary to ensure the freedom and civil rights for all Americans. Without constitutional provisions, changes that would need made to improve the Constitution and life of Americans would not be done. Constitutional provisions for freedom of speech and press. The very first constitutional provision for freedom of speech came in 1791. James Madison presented the 10 Amendments to the United States government, which included freedom of speech and press under the First Amendment. The first version of freedom of speech in the United States guaranteed the freedom of expression for citizens. However, what kind of speech is protected under the law is mainly decided by the courts. The typical kinds of speech that are not protected under this law is obscene material, defamation, true threats, and plagiarism of copyrighted content. Provisions of freedom of speech minorities. Although the constitutional provisions enforce that all residents should receive rights such as freedom of speech, not all actual residents were given these rights. African Americans who should have been considered citizens were viewed as property, so they were not deemed eligible for these freedoms. Hispanics also had a hard time with being given these rights as after the Mexican-American War, the majority of Hispanics lost their property to the United States once the land considered their territory. Any usage of freedom of speech by Hispanics were ignored or met with negative responses. Native Americans were also unsuccessful in receiving any rights like freedom of speech, even though the tribes had been located there before the United States was established. They were also forced off their land and were met with violence if there was any reasons that they did not have the opportunity to exercise freedom of speech. History of provisions for freedom of speech minorities. Even though the right was not given to minorities right away, they would later receive and unionized it once they embraced the fact that they were United States citizens too. During the civil rights movement of 1960, freedom of speech was one of the main methods used that contributed to the creation of the Civil Rights Act, which enforced equality among all. In 1940s and 1950s, Hispanics used freedom of speech in the Chicano movement to gain more civil rights, which they were successful in, and it also contributed to the empowerment of Mexican Americans in the United States. Native Americans will also recognize their right to freedom of speech and used to advocate for equality, and it was successful as it led to the Native American Civil Rights Act.
Is freedom of speech and expression. My relevant constitutional provision representing this will be Amendment 1. This amendment prevents the government from making any law that regulates or restricts any citizen from their freedom of speech or expression. This amendment even extends to any article of clothing or a symbol relaying a message. My relevant Supreme Court decision for this would be Cohen versus California in 1971. The Supreme Court ruled that the Amendment 1 protected his rights, Paul Cohen's rights to wear this jacket that said F the draft in his response to not wanting to